Hello and welcome. My name is Phil Naylor and this is Tea with a Therapist. So please grab your tea or beverage of your choice and join me for my tea as we talk about things, all things psychotherapy, all things mental wellness and personal development. So today's topic is anxiety, part two. Last time we covered part one, so we're kind of breaking that into two topics, although it's a big topic, so even this isn't going to really cover it in depth as much as I want to. But anyway, just a little bit about myself for people that don't know me or just joining. My name is Phil Naylor. I'm a psychotherapist and I have been working in the field of mental health for about 20 years, and actually more than that if you count the kind of type of work I did very related to mental health and psychotherapy about 10 or 15 years prior to that, which had to do with the social networks and systems and social work, more or less, I guess, social development stuff. So, and Tea with a Therapist is just my attempt to kind of provide education to people out there, to help people share my knowledge about what I know about how we work, about mental health and wellness, because it's such a big issue out in there, out everywhere. Mental health is a big issue. We've got a lot of stressors in our world, a lot of challenges, and mental health issues are on the rise. But we're given very little information and education about how we work, about our psychological structure, about our mental wellness. We kind of get fed little bits and pieces all over the place, but it's not really pulled together in a comprehensive way. And so this is my attempt to just share what I know and to put it out there into the world to hopefully benefit people. So just to as a proviso that this is meant to be information and education. It's not a psychotherapy session right here. I'm just sharing my knowledge and information. I've got a little bit of shift in format today, and actually going forward, this will be a shift in format. This isn't a live session, this is actually pre-recorded, and I'm posting it both on Facebook and on my YouTube channel so people can access it for a number of reasons. One, that when I review the videos, there's some places in there the quality's not that good, it breaks up, or the sound's not good. Also, because I'm just beginning this, I don't have like a large following of people on Facebook to interact with. So until that happens, I'm just going to provide this as just a regular posting. And I may occasionally have a live session where people can actually ask questions. So maybe after you've watched a few Tea with Therapists, you may have some questions, and I'll provide an opportunity periodically where you can ask those questions and we can have a little bit more interactive time. But for now, we'll do it like this and we'll see how it goes. I think a lot more people seem to access it after the fact than during the live broadcast anyway. So enough about kind of the housekeeping stuff. Let's move on to our topic. So just to recap, last week we talked about the fact that anxiety was both a physiological and a psychological issue, a process. Both sides were involved, our psychology and our physiology. We talked mostly about the physiological aspect, how it works, and how physiologically anxiety is generated. And we use this analogy of the bear and seeing the bear and how it provokes this fight-flight response, and then we then get hypervigilant around similar situations, so that once we've had a bad encounter with a bear, when we're in the woods or in similar territory where it looks like we had a bear encounter, we're going to be anxious and we're going to be looking for the bear. So, and we started to talk a little bit about the interaction between psychology and physiology, because we can start to imagine scenarios. We can imagine there's a bear there even if there isn't, and that provokes the same kind of physiological response. And we can also project into the future, and we can recall past events. So any of those, when we projecting into the future or recalling past, that can evoke the same physiological response, because we're actually replaying a scene in our eye, or we're playing a scene in our minds that our bodies sees as a threat, and it responds accordingly. And so when I work with people with anxiety, I take both sides of that coin. I take both a physiological and a psychological approach, and I get people first starting on the physiological, because working on our physiological response is just a lot easier and straightforward. Anybody can do breathing exercises and grounding activities, or take some yoga or something like that that's aimed at calming and soothing the nervous system. So it's straightforward, gets fast results, isn't a complete cure by any means, but it gets us linked into the idea that there's some physiological practices that we can do to take care of our anxiety, or to help manage our anxiety. But that's one half of the equation. Today we're focused on the second half of the equation, which is a little bit more complex, and that is managing our psychology, and understanding and using some techniques that we can use to help manage our psychology, so that we are changing essentially our perceptions, that we're not feeding ourselves threat or anxiety images. So that is the part that most people come to psychotherapy for, because they don't know how to do that well. So, and it is a lot easier when you have somebody helping you, a coach, somebody giving you reflection and feedback, take that information and feed it back to you faster. But there's still a lot of things that we can do on our own that is very helpful in helping us to manage our anxiety. So I'm just taking a sip. Okay, so where do we start? So focusing our mind, the very basic thing that we need to do is to become self-aware. We have to start to, if we're going to start to manage our psychology, we have to be aware of our psychology. So that means we have to start to tune into our thoughts and our feelings around anxiety. And that sounds fairly basic, but there's a lot of people that really don't understand why they're anxious, and they don't understand or notice the subtle thoughts that are taking place internally that are generating anxiety. So there could be little things. It could just say, oh, a lot of it is, so what if this happens? What if this thing happens? All we have to do is that little thing, that little thought of what if this happens? Or we create a picture of some sort of disaster happening. Or we remember something that was negative and causes anxiety. So we have these internal processes that trigger the fight-flight response physiologically. So we can manage the physiology all we want, but until we start to manage the threat signals that are coming from our brain, our perception, it's only going to have limited impact. And so the first step, as I say, is self-awareness. We have to start to slow our thoughts down and tune into what is it that is triggering us. What is it, the perception, and what's the thought that we're thinking that is creating a threat scenario, and thus making our bodies respond. And the basic tool of self-awareness is the practice of mindfulness. Now, that's sort of kind of a term that's, a lot of people know what mindfulness is, or it's a popular term right now. And mindfulness is, you might just replace that with awareness. So it's practicing self-awareness. And the way we practice mindfulness, some of the typical mindfulness practices, and you'll find this now very much incorporated into therapy, especially things like CBT and DBT. It's cultivating the internal awareness of what's going on. We start by, a simple exercise would be sitting quietly, and then start to notice first your external surroundings. What are you noticing physiologically? So, what am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? What am I tasting? What am I touching or smelling? Anything like that. Just being aware of your senses. So when you heighten your awareness and slow your thought process down to just, what am I feeling? And what am I experiencing from a physical perspective, from a sensory perspective, then we shift internally to what am I thinking right now? What am I feeling right now? And you start to tune in to the thoughts that are floating through your mind. So if you're not sort of introspectively oriented, you may miss a lot of thoughts that are going on, and you just feel like your anxiety is out of control because you don't know what's triggering it. So first step is to slow down and say, okay, why am I anxious? What's going on? What's the thing that it could have been something somebody said? It could be a piece of news or information you got. Or whatever it is, be aware, oh, that triggered my anxiety. And so that is the beginning process of how we start to manage. From there, we can apply tools, because then we can apply tools against those thoughts and feelings that we're experiencing. There are many tools. I'm just going to go through a few here, but the follow-on from awareness is what I call the drill down method. The drill down method is drilling down to the very thing at the bottom of what's causing your anxiety, because sometimes somebody saying or doing something in itself doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. And even the things that are big of a deal, sometimes we're not aware of the root of why that thing is making us anxious. So this is a method taken from CBT, or cognitive behavior therapy. And that's simply, and this is basically most of the CBT that I utilize now. It's sort of the core of CBT as far as I'm concerned. A lot of CBT, the preliminary CBT, is actually the awareness part, because they spend a lot of time walking you through exercises of actually charting, I felt anxious this morning, and what was going on when I felt anxious, and what happened just prior to that. And then you have to break it down into what thoughts came into my head, and then what feelings did I have. And so you chart them out. And so the first part of CBT is actually cultivating that self-awareness. But I kind of jump to the, just get to the core of the thing and start to use I'm not sure what it's actually called. I just call it the drill down method. And that is following your thought path as to what is actually making you anxious. So, you could be anxious at work. Okay, work is making you anxious. And then you think about, okay, why am I getting anxious about going into work? Then you might think, oh, well, they've introduced these new procedures, and I don't feel confident in doing those, and so that's making me anxious. But then you would follow that question with, well, why is that making you anxious? So we have a series of whys here. So why is that making me anxious? Then you might think, well, because if I can't get these, then I'm going to look stupid in front of everybody else. I'm going to look like not competent, and everybody else is going to be ahead of me. And then you might think, well, why does that make me anxious then? Then you might think, well, because then everybody will see that I can't do this stuff, and they'll know that I'm not really capable. And maybe they'll start to talk about me or something. And then you think, okay, and why would that make me anxious? And then you think, well, because then I'd kind of be rejected by everybody. I'd kind of be abandoned by everybody, and I, would feel incompetent, and I'd feel like a failure. Okay, and then you think, and so what about being a failure is making you anxious? Well, what happens to failures are people that are not good enough, people that aren't good enough, and that nobody wants to be around them, and they're rejected, and they're just not worth anything. And usually that's about how far our path goes. It usually stops at this sort of failure and rejection, abandonment, not good enough thing. At the core of it is often, I'm not good enough. And that's what we call a core belief. And that is the thing that really creates the anxiety. And our brains kind of make that, we kind of walk through this connection very deliberately, as I just did. And when you do it consciously, it takes a couple of minutes just to kind of work through, why is that making me anxious? Why is that making me anxious? But subconsciously, all of that happens immediately. Your subconscious mind exactly has gone through that process and arrived at that I'm not good enough thing right away. And it's the pain of that not being good enough, and that feeling of overwhelmed and just being not worthy. It's the pain of that we ultimately fear. And so once we understand what our core beliefs are that it's a not good enough issue, we can kind of start to jump over all of that process and know immediately that it's a not good enough issue, that I'm not good enough, or I'm going to be abandoned. If I was to say that basically the common things that most kind of this drill down method will take you to is feelings of abandonment, which is the same kind of thing. I'm alone, unsupported, uncared about, and left to my own devices, to failure, that I'm just not good enough, and or feeling that you're going to be in some situation that you don't feel you have the skills to cope with. You know, so I'm going to lose my job and I'll be out on the street and I'll have a little cop begging and I couldn't take that. So we'll have some scenario that creates anxiety. So those are the kind of big ones, and most people have those. Most people have those sorts of issues that they drill down to, okay? So that's important when we start to get to the root of what it is that's creating anxiety. So first is awareness and drilling down to the root, okay? But that isn't often enough to start to shift the anxiety either. So we need to employ some strategies or techniques to help us shift off of that. Some of them are simpler and some of them are more complex. I'm just going to go over some of the most common one, but there's many more, okay? So just for starters, we want fast methods to shift our one state of being and to get us out of that thought stream and that perceptual stream. So some of the simplest methods that we use is, first of all, thought stopping. So we've got these thoughts that are going, oh my God, this is happening, and these, you know, creating these pictures and everything. And you have to generate an awareness that you're doing that, and that's creating anxiety. And so the first thing you want to do is stop it. And so thought stopping is a very basic technique that just says stop to yourself. You just, in your mind, say stop. You can visualize a stop sign and just stop that mind chatter. And the follow-on from that is to immediately redirect your mind to a different thought. Usually you want to pre-select a positive thought. A positive, it could be a memory or something that when you think of that thought, it could be, you know, take a memory, you had a great vacation, you're laying on the beach or whatever, and it was beautiful, and you can easily recall that. So you practice stopping your thought and redirecting onto that pre-designated thought, positive thought. And your goal is to hold that thought for 15 seconds without interruption. So that we don't keep, because our mind will want to keep coming back to the negative thoughts. So we need to build up an ability to manage our thoughts. And essentially, the bottom line of managing anxiety is learning to manage your thoughts. And because it's your thoughts that your feelings flow from. So we first have to perceive something as bad in order to have a bad feeling about it. So that's what we're trying to do in some of these exercises, is that in that process of thought stopping, you stop that pattern of the mind keeping running on that same thing, and you redirect it under another positive thought consciously, and you consciously hold that thought for at least 15 seconds. It may be hard at first because some people can only hold it for a few seconds before they go back to the old thought. So you have to keep practicing that until you can hold that thought for 15 seconds. And so that is sort of training your mind to be able to, training yourself to be able to redirect things. There's some follow-on stuff from that as well, but I'm just going to kind of move on to something else. And another technique is called EFT, or Emotional Freedom Technique. This looks kind of hokey. And if you Google EFT, or Emotional Freedom Technique, or best EFT tapping or body tapping, because there's other things that mean EFT, but EFT tapping, you'll come up with all kinds of books and seminars and websites and YouTube videos and all this sort of thing. But basically, it is about tapping on essentially acupuncture points. There's different ones, different methods, some top of the head, under the arm, all this kind of stuff. But it actually, partly how this technique works is it's in self sort of thought stopping thing, because it's interrupting that thought pathway. It's interrupting that thought flow by getting you to kind of do this tapping and So there's a ritual that kind of goes with it and things that you may say. I can't go into detail too much about it here, but I would encourage you to look up EFT and find out a little bit more about it. Even look up EFT for anxiety. I'm sure there's YouTube videos and things out there for that. So that is a way of actually also changing your state, because you're tapping on your physiology, your physical self. And there's a number of processes that go, you're talking out loud, and there's a number of things that interrupt or interfere with that flow of anxiety and changes your state. Changes you from a fear state to another state, and there's calming patterns and everything else that go on. So if you can learn that, that's a good simple technique to use to start to break up that flow and to work with your anxiety. Another thing is visualization. Now this is important, and we're going to be talking a lot more about visualization and the power of that, because it's an easy technique, and again, it's about learning to control your thoughts and your inputs about what's going on. So we talked about in the previous one how the bear, the threat thought, creates a physiological response. So everything that we think that's negative is creating this physiological response. But it also works in reverse. So if you think positive thought, you're also inducing a positive physiological state. So if you think of beautiful and safe and enjoyable things, if you create that in your mind, there's a reflection of that in your body as well. And so this is one of the reasons I do hypnosis. Hypnosis is essentially relaxation and visualization, and using images and ideas and suggestions to help shift some of these. We already touched on core belief, these habitual patterns and core belief patterns. That's the subject for another day, which I will talk about. But cultivating our ability to visualize positive pictures, because when we are visualizing negative pictures, that's creating anxiety. That's part of the definition of anxiety, is creating negative pictures in your head. So the counter to that is to create positive pictures in your head. So we already did that with the thought stopping and redirecting. But you can also just take time in a meditation state by calming your body and visualizing something positive. The thing that you're having anxiety about, instead of focusing on the negative picture, focus on creating a positive outcome to that situation. Just imagine that situation being resolved and you're feeling good, and so you're actually kind of telling your brain that that's going to be the end point of all of this as well. So practicing visualization of positive outcomes, or visualization of just positive things, is important. Another process that is helpful is journaling. So some people, this is mixed, some people are journalers and some aren't. I'm not particularly a journaler, but for some people it's a really good tool. And it's also helps you to generate the self-awareness if you're having trouble with that. So you sit down with a piece of paper and you start writing about what you're anxious about, or you start writing about your day, and as you start to write, that you start to follow your thought process, because you have to be mindful of what you're thinking in order to write. And so, and it's helping you process it in a different way. And you can actually start to get yourself out of a negative state by writing your way through it. And one thing, it slows the process down, so you're able to think about it in a different way. And so a lot of people, and then you can put positive affirmations in there. There's all kinds of ways to use journaling. So you can use affirmations. You can say positive things to yourself and positive ideas. You can do that in your head as well as through a journal. Some people use journal as a gratitude practice, that they think of, just no matter how bad things are, think of 3 things they're grateful for. And that orients your mind towards the appreciation of life, and that there are good things in life and not just bad outcomes, because that's where our mind goes, to bad outcomes a lot. And then all of this boils down, and there are many other sort of techniques that I could go over, but we're going to be running out of time. So I just wanted to kind of boil it down to what does all this kind of boil down to. It boils down to positive self-talk and coaching. So you need to kind of take control of the thoughts in your head And I say that most people have a bad coach in their head. So if you think about, what are you saying to yourself? I'm sorry, but I hate to break to you, but we all talk to ourselves. We all talk to ourselves in our head. That's just part of the human condition. So we have a voice in our head that says things to us, and it usually says negative things, especially in regards to things that create anxiety. So, and there's an explanation for that. It goes back to our old conditioning. There's societal messages, there's parental messages. And so I often say if you talk to your friends the way that you talk to yourself in your mind, you wouldn't have any friends because they'd be horrible. That'd be a horrible way to talk to people. And we talk to ourselves horribly. So it's like, you stupid this, and how could you do that? And you're going to fail at that, and what's the matter with you, and all this. And so that's what I call the negative coach. And because if you're a coach and you're coaching people to do things, to learn a skill, and all you're doing is yelling at them and berating them and telling them they're stupid and they're no good at this and they're just going to completely fail, you wouldn't have many coaching students because they'd all walk out and you'd make them feel really bad and you'd ruin their ability to learn because you're instilling a belief that they can't learn. Whereas a positive coach, if anybody's ever worked with a good coach, you know that a good coach both sees reality but also encourages and doesn't berate people. So we tend to kind of, a good coach encourages rather than berates. So rather than if there's somebody coaching gymnastics, the person can't get that move, they'll keep modeling it for them, giving them instructions, but then also encouraging them. Say, it's okay. You're going to do fine. This is great. You're practicing and you're going to get there. And you've got all the skills and abilities you need. Hey, you can do it. That's it. That's right. So we have the positive coach that doesn't berate, but encourages. And you actually have to develop the positive coach in your mind. It becomes kind of a new part of you that kind of pushes the negative coach out of the way and starts to steer you in a positive direction. And so you want a new voice in your head to provide new coaching and new thoughts and ideas. And so essentially that's what we're doing with anxiety. And also there's also practical solutions too. We need to think through the thing what's our reality of our situation, and think through what's the practical answer to that situation. Because sometimes we get frozen and say, oh my God, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Or that we're anxious because we're procrastinating on something and not getting it done. So sometimes the answer is get that thing done, address that thing that's actually bothering you so you can resolve the problem. So that's another aspect of anxiety management as well. So if we want to boil it down, though, it is all about managing our thoughts. It's practicing the skill of, and it is a skill, of learning to observe and change and manage your thoughts. Because until you do that, your thoughts manage you and your feelings manage you. But when we start to gain that awareness and practice the skill set, we learn that we can manage it. And that's called empowerment. When that you are not relying on external situations to change in order for us to feel good. We're able to coach our way through that. So essentially the process is awareness and being able to kind of analyze, drill down on our thought pattern to understand what's at the root, the fundamental root of what's creating anxiety, and be able to apply tools to shift out of those negative thought states, the feeling state and the thought state, thought stopping, redirecting positive thought. What else did I talk about? Using techniques like EFT. That's a really easy technique to learn. It's very helpful. It's not like the miracle thing that some of them present it to be, but it's just a helpful technique. And then positive visualization of positive outcomes, journaling, and ultimately developing the positive coach voice. And you'll find that it may be easier to develop that positive coach voice through journaling as well. Okay, so use that as a technique for developing the positive coach. So, like I say, it is fairly straightforward to do, not necessarily easy because it's a skill set to develop. So don't get discouraged if you keep falling back into the same old negative thinking cycles, because it's a skill you practice. So any new thing that you learn, you could be learning a musical instrument and you're really awkward at first, playing the sax or whatever it is that you're playing, guitar. So, it sounds really kind of terrible at first, but as you practice, it gets smoother and easier, and eventually you can just improvise and be an amazing musician. So go out there and learn to manage yourself. Learn that this isn't anything that is rocket science, but you need a few good tools and techniques, and keep being persistent and working at it. So anyway, thank you for joining me. So our time is up, and please join me next time for Bring Your Tea and sit and have a chat. And I will see you next time for session 4. And please leave any comments or suggestions you would like for any additional topics that you'd like me to cover. Until then, thank you for joining me.